It was an epic struggle fought by every Russian man, woman, and child against the most feared enemy of this century, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. To Americans, it was World War II. To the people of Russia, it was known by another name, the Great Patriotic War. Russian filmmakers recorded their war against fascism as testimony to the bravery and fortitude of the Russian people. Now, after half a century, this great documentary record is finally available to the West. Don't miss this exciting 13-part series. Join us as we experience for the first time the unforgettable Russian film documentaries of the Great Patriotic War. Like the rest of the world, Russia and the other Soviet socialist republics watched as Hitler's mad scheme for world domination unfolded across Europe. The Road to War, the first exciting episode of the Great Patriotic War, is the Russian motion picture chronicle of the rise of Nazism and its profound effect upon Russia and the entire world. Among these Russian films is Mikhail Rom's Ordinary Fascism, a scathing look at Hitler's career and character and the nature of the regime he established. Operation Barbarossa was the code name for the attack on Moscow, the Germans' attempt to turn Moscow into a lake and the Soviet Union west of the Urals into a German province. The film documents the devastation of German air power and artillery as Hitler's divisions swept their way across the Russian countryside. The Russians would respond to this threat against their homeland, rallying around Stalin and meeting the Germans in what would become the formidable Eastern Front, the theater of war which would eventually suck up and destroy the might of the great German army. The Battle of Moscow would be fought in the grim Russian winter of 1941. Hitler's divisions were closing in on Moscow. War had come, and the citizens prepared for their city to become a major battleground. Director Ilya Kopalin's gripping documentary, The German Defeat at Moscow, records the advance of the German army toward the Russian capital. It shows how Russian forces under the command of General Zhukov counterattacked the Nazis and regained the villages and towns taken by German aggression. The Russians fought back to hand Hitler his first massive defeat. Against Zhukov's forces, the Germans would lose tens of thousands of soldiers, as well as surrendering huge numbers of tanks and artillery to the Russians. The German defeat at Moscow gave the world renewed hope, for it demonstrated finally that Hitler's armies were not undefeatable, and that victory over these forces of evil was possible. Kopalin's documentary also shows the terrible price the Russian people paid for their victory, and vividly reveals that for Russia, even triumph could not cloak the horror of the war against the Nazis. In October of 1941, the Nazis overran the Crimea and threatened the Russian naval port of Sebastopol. In his exciting documentary, The Seamen of the Black Sea, director Vasily Belyaev tells the story of how, for 250 days, the Russian soldiers, sailors, and civilians of Sebastopol held out against Hitler's forces only to finally fall to the overwhelming assault of the Germans. They paid a terrible price, but their resistance helped to turn the tide against fascism. The city of Stalingrad on the Volga was the site of perhaps the greatest single battle in history. Here at Stalingrad, the Russians would fight the Germans for 6 long, brutal months. In this single battle, the Russians would sustain more casualties than the United States would suffer in the entire war. In the 7-reel feature Stalingrad, director Leonid Varlamov tells the story of the battle and siege of Stalingrad. This monumental work, released barely 6 weeks after the surrender of German forces there, was the effort of 15 cameramen who traveled with the Russian forces as the battle raged. Unwilling to heed the warning of his own generals, Adolf Hitler ordered his divisions to endure the winter of 1942 and allowed the Russians to slowly pulverize the Nazi forces. Of the 300,000 German soldiers that attacked Stalingrad, fewer than 5,000 ever returned to their native Germany. This was modern war on a scale not before seen in history. Stalingrad reveals that the will of the Russian people and the bitterness of the Russian climate once again stymied European dreams of easy conquest over the Asian continent. With his generals humiliated and his army destroyed, it was this battle that forever doomed Hitler and the Nazis. After the terrible defeat at Stalingrad, the German army headed west into the heart of the Ukraine in an anxious search for victory. 2 films by Ukrainian director Alexander Dovzhenko, The Fight for Our Soviet Ukraine and Victory on the Right Bank, tell this exciting, little-known story of World War II. Inspired by his own personal, passionate love for his native Ukraine, Dovzhenko's 2 films reveal the tenacious spirit of the people of the Ukraine as they face the onslaught of the Nazi war machine. As in America, Russia's industry turned to war. In the defense of their homeland, Russian workers toiled day and night to manufacture the arms and goods needed to fight the Nazis. In our 2-part presentation, Soviet directors Zhiga Vertov and Fyodor Kiselev examined the home front, the stories of how everyday Russian workers undertook the Herculean effort of supplying the Red Army. From the drawing boards to the factories to the mines and the farms, this is the story of the will of the Russian people. Out past the front, behind enemy lines, inside the huge territory held by Hitler's Wehrmacht, Russian soldiers and civilians comprised a hidden army dedicated to the destruction of the Nazi Empire. These brave men and women staged ambushes, harassed the German army, and attacked supply lines in lightning attacks upon their sworn foe. Often, at the hands of the Germans, these brave people paid a heavy price. In Vasily Belyaev's The People's Avenger and Komarev's Beyond the Enemy's Frontier, scenes shot behind enemy lines tell the story of the brave Russian partisans who did what they could to turn the tide of Nazi aggression. Wherever the Red Army went the Russian cameramen. Taking combat cameras into battle, they recorded for posterity this plague of violence which had erupted across their motherland. In the years of the war, combat footage would pour into the central newsreel studio in Moscow from all along the vast Russian front. Reel after reel of combat footage gave evidence of the epic struggle that the Soviets faced. The risks these cameramen confronted were formidable. One cameraman, Vladimir Suchinsky, died with his camera running, the frame gyrating in his death throes, only to come to rest staring up at the calm sky over Russia. Others died as well, as they strove to compile a vast visual document of the Russian battle against Hitler's forces. 2 Russian films, The Combat Cameraman and On the Road with the Soldier, provide a behind-the-scenes look at these brave cameramen and the dangers they faced. No event better dramatized the suffering endured by the Russian people than the 900-day siege of Leningrad. Leningrad Fights, a film supervised by Roman Karman, one of the greatest of all Soviet documentary filmmakers, tells the story of this epic battle for Russia's second city. Nearly 1 million people perished from hunger, disease, and exposure. Its citizens endured the siege and fought to maintain their livelihoods, their arts and culture, and their dignity under the brutal circumstances of German oppression. The city's survival and eventual victory is an unrivaled of common people's courage in our time. Largely unknown to the West are the Russian officers who led their armies, first in vain attempting to hold back the German divisions in 1941, but ultimately in victory against the Nazis in 1945. During the Great Patriotic War, these men rose from obscurity to become national heroes of the Soviet Union. Exemplified by Marshal Zhukov, perhaps the greatest of them all, they were tested and proven in total warfare, forged by campaigns and battles like Stalingrad and Leningrad. These officers, who emerged eventually victorious in leading the Red Army against Nazi Germany, returned home in 1945, some to rise further in Soviet affairs, others banished to Siberian obscurity. The Red Marshals is their story. Uli Reisman's Berlin tells the story of the Russian march west and the capture of the German capital city of Berlin. The Soviet High Command had told its troops that the time to finally extinguish the Nazi threat had at last arrived, but Berlin would not fall easily. Even as defeat became certain, the Germans fought on. The city was heavily fortified. Hitler ordered his army to fight to the last man. After 7 days of fierce street-by-street fighting, Russian soldiers finally reached the Reichstag. Against a background of exploding shells and bombs and a city black with smoke, the Russians raised the Soviet scarlet flag over the German Capitol building. Russian and American troops would meet in Berlin, and in a moment of relief, if not glory, would shake hands to commonly resolve that the Great Patriotic War was indeed over. The Nazi Germans would formally surrender a few days later under the supervision of the Allied powers, the United States, England, France, and the Soviet Union. As one great conflict was at last over, here in Berlin, the uneasy alliance of the Allies would soon crumble. Another kind of war, the Cold War, would be born in this city of Berlin. Nearly half a century would pass before America and Russia would once again seek common goals and a common ground. In the aftermath of the war, there still remained many tasks. Russian director Roman Karman and his crew traveled to Germany to cover the Nuremberg war trials. In the last days of the war, Allied camera crews assigned to liberation forces began returning film of scenes so terrible as to be beyond mortal comprehension. Images of wholesale human brutality soon etched themselves into the consciousness of the Allied powers. It became clear they had defeated an adversary far more evil than had been previously imagined. In the court of Nuremberg, the Russians joined their wartime allies in an attempt to try the men responsible for the deaths of 20 million of their sons and daughters. Roman Karman's The Trial of the People is a haunting documentary of this final chapter of the Great Patriotic War, an unforgettable account of the historic events at Nuremberg as the entire world strove for justice and retribution. The Great Patriotic War is a dynamic documentary series chronicling the incredible story of the Russian fight against Nazi Germany. Made available for the first time through unprecedented cooperation between Russian and American film producers, this series presents a picture of the Russian people in their fight against fascism as never before witnessed in America. After half a century of mutual suspicion, the Great Patriotic War blasts through the remains of the Iron Curtain to reveal to the freedom-loving people of America the anguish and horror the Russians somehow survived under the Nazi scourge, and why they swore upon the graves of their 20 million war dead they would never again be humiliated. Don't miss the Great Patriotic War.